The Wyoming wind tasted of dust and endings. It scraped across the cracked earth a relentless sigh that promised nothing but more. Of the same, more sun, more grit, more loneliness. Eleanor Dawson felt it seep through the very boards of the stagecoach, a cold welcome to the settlement of Willow Creek. She pressed her forehead against the grimy glass, watching the landscape blur into a monotonous palette of bleached bone and bruised sage. The coach lurched to a halt, throwing her against the worn leather. "End of the line," Miss the driver called, his voice as rough as the land itself. Eleanor gathered her traveling dress, the fine Boston wool now caked with a week's worth of prairie dust, and stepped down onto the hard-packed main street. The October sun hammered down on the valley, baking the cracked earth until it resembled a broken plate. A handful of weathered buildings lined the street, their wooden facades warped and pale. This was it. The place where her old life, the life of disgraced Senator Dawson's daughter, would be buried. And a new one as the respectable wife of Mr. Charles Whitley would begin. She was just reaching to smooth her hair when the world erupted. Glass shattered. A woman screamed. The sharp crack of a pistol shot ripped through the afternoon stillness, followed by another and another. Horses tethered to a nearby post shrieked in terror, their eyes rolling white. From the front of the Willow Creek bank, two masked men burst out, canvas sacks slung over their shoulders. "Move, get the horses," one of them yelled. Panic seized the street. A shopkeeper dove back into his store. A woman clutching a child scrambled for cover. The stagecoach driver, who had been unloading her trunk, dropped it with a thud and flattened himself behind a water trough. Eleanor stood frozen, a statue of dark wool in a maelstrom of dust and fear. A third man, clearly the leader, backed out of the bank, a pistol in each hand. His eyes, cold and dark above a bandana, scanned the street. They landed on Eleanor, on the glint of silver at her throat. Before she could react, he was on her. He moved with a predator's speed, closing the distance in 3 long strides. His hand, rough and smelling of sweat and gunpowder, shot out and ripped the locket from her neck. The delicate chain snapped. No. The cry was torn from her, a sound of pure anguish. It wasn't the silver she cared for. It was the tiny faded photograph inside. Her mother's face, the only thing she had left of her. The man, Morrison, gave a cruel laugh. Pretty trinket for a pretty lady. He stuffed it into his pocket. "Now stay put unless you want something worse." "That's enough, Morrison. We got what we came for," one of the others shouted from horseback. But Morrison was enjoying himself. He took a step toward Eleanor, his intentions clear in his leering eyes, when a voice cut through the chaos, calm and steady. "Leave the lady alone." Eleanor turned her head. A lone rancher had stepped out from the alley beside the blacksmith's shop. He was lean and weathered, his face carved by wind and sun into something honest and unpretentious. Dark hair showed beneath his worn hat, and his eyes, a startling blue against his tanned skin, held a quiet fire. He held no weapon, only his own 2 hands, open at his sides. Morrison turned, snarling, "Mind your own business, farmer, or I'll put you in the ground." "Trouble finds folks out here," the rancher said, his voice even. "Best not to go looking for more of it." He took a slow step forward, placing himself between Eleanor and the robber. It was a brave move, a foolish one. Morrison was a wolf, and this man had just offered himself up as the sheep. "Your mistake," Morrison spat and raised his pistol. A shot rang out, sharp and final. Dust and fear choked the air. But it wasn't the rancher who fell. He had moved with surprising speed, lunging forward not to attack, but to knock the pistol's aim aside. The bullet slammed into the wooden facade of the general store. In the same motion, the rancher drove his shoulder into Morrison's chest, sending the bigger man stumbling backward. For a moment it seemed he might have the upper hand. Then one of the other robbers, already mounted, spurred his horse forward. The butt of his rifle came down in a vicious arc, catching the rancher on the side of the head. He staggered, a pained grunt escaping his lips. Morrison, recovering his balance, drove a fist into his stomach. The rancher doubled over. "Thomas," a voice cried from the crowd. Morrison raised his pistol again, this time, aiming it directly at the head of the man he now knew as Thomas. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. But before Morrison could fire, the sound of a shotgun being cocked echoed from the doorway of the general store. The shopkeeper stood there, his face pale, but his hands steady. "Get out of my town," he said. Morrison hesitated, weighing his lust for violence against the double-barreled threat. He spat on the ground beside Thomas's crumpled form. "Let's ride." The gang spurred their horses, thundering out of town in a cloud of brown dust, taking the bank's money and Eleanor's locket with them. For a moment the street was utterly silent, save for the low, mournful sigh of the wind. Then the world rushed back in. People emerged from hiding their voices, a low murmur of shock and relief. But Eleanor only had eyes for the man on the ground. She rushed to his side, kneeling in the dirt, her fine dress forgotten. "Are you all right?" He pushed himself into a sitting position, his hand going to his head. Blood seeped through his fingers. "Just a knock," he grunted, though his face was pale. He looked at her, his blue eyes searching her face. "He didn't hurt you?" "No, because of you. You saved me." The words were a whisper. He tried to stand but swayed. Eleanor caught his arm, her touch surprisingly firm. "You're hurt. Let me see." She gently pulled his hand away. A nasty gash bled freely just above his temple. Ignoring the gasps of the onlookers and the impropriety of it all, Eleanor tore a strip of clean linen from her petticoat. With hands that were surprisingly steady, she pressed the makeshift bandage to the wound. "Hold this," she commanded softly. He did as he was told, his eyes never leaving her face. In that moment, surrounded by the aftermath of violence, an unspoken bond formed between them, a connection forged in courage and sealed with a simple act of care. "Ma'am," he said, his voice hoarse. "Thomas Callahan." "Eleanor Dawson." The shopkeeper approached, shotgun still in hand. "Tom, you all right?" That was a fool thing to do. "Had to be done," Thomas Callahan said simply, his gaze still fixed on Eleanor. The stagecoach driver reappeared, his face ashen. "You the mail-order bride for Whitley?" he asked Eleanor, his voice shaky. Eleanor nodded, the name a jarring note in the chaos. Charles Whitley, her intended, a man who was supposed to meet her, to protect her, a man who was nowhere to be seen. "I was sent to collect you," Thomas said, pushing himself to his feet with a wince. "Mr. Whitley was delayed. Sent word for me to bring you to my place until he could fetch you." Eleanor stared at him, at the blood on his temple and the dust on his clothes, at the quiet strength in his gaze. She had traveled 2,000 miles for the promise of a safe, respectable life, with a man she'd never met. Instead, she had arrived in a storm of gunfire, lost her most precious possession, and been saved by a stranger who had nearly died for her honor. Nothing was as it should be. And yet, as Thomas Callahan stood before her, offering shelter in this wild, unpredictable land, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Not safety, not yet, but something that might one day become it. The sun hammered down on the valley, bleaching the land to bone. Thomas Callahan's ranch was nestled in a small hollow, a modest cabin with a sturdy barn and corral, looking as though it had grown from the earth itself. Smoke rose from the chimney, a thin, welcoming plume against the merciless, blinding blue of the sky. It wasn't the grand estate Whitley had described in his letters, but after the violence in town, its sturdy simplicity felt like a sanctuary. "It's not much," Thomas said as he helped her down from his horse, his hands careful and respectful at her waist, "but it's quiet." Inside the cabin was clean and spare, the domain of a man who lived a solitary life. Light from the single window illuminated rough-hewn furniture, a stone fireplace, and shelves lined with a few well-worn books. The air smelled of wood-smoked coffee and the faint, clean scent of pine. He showed her to a small room off the main area, barely larger than a Boston closet, but it was private with a simple bed and a clean patchwork quilt. "I know this isn't proper, ma'am," he said, his gaze fixed on a point just over her shoulder. Whitley should have been there. "A flash flood up north," he said, "washed out the bridge." Eleanor studied him. The lie, if it was one, wasn't his. It was Whitley's. "The bank robbery," she said, her voice quiet. "You didn't have to step in. You could have been killed." His jaw tightened. "Couldn't stand by. Not my way." He turned away, busying himself at the stove. "I'll heat some stew. You must be hungry." Eleanor was the daughter of a United States senator, raised in a world of suffocating etiquette and whispered scandals. Her father had disowned her not for a crime, but for an act of conscience. She had broken her engagement to a cruel but powerful man, and in doing so had disrupted a politically advantageous alliance. Her flight west was not just a search for a husband. It was a desperate bid for independence, a chance to build a life on her own terms, free from the judgment of Boston society. Now she found herself utterly dependent on the kindness of a stranger, a haunted man who chose his words as carefully as a prospector searching for gold. They ate in a companionable silence, the simple meal of stew and cornbread, more satisfying than any of the formal dinners she had endured. He asked no questions about her past, and for that she was grateful. She found herself watching him, the way his scarred hands were gentle as he handled the dishes, the quiet purpose in his movements. He seemed a man at peace in his solitude, but not she sensed content with it. There were shadows in his startling blue eyes, ghosts of a past he did not speak of. "Lock your door if it makes you feel safer," he said as he prepared to leave for the night. "I'll be in the barn if you need anything." The barn, Eleanor was shocked. "But this is your home. You're a lady under my roof, even temporarily." He said, his tone firm, leaving no room for argument. It wouldn't be proper otherwise. After he left, Eleanor sat by the dying fire, her thoughts churning. She ran a hand over her bare neck where the locket had been. The loss was a physical ache, a severing of her last link to a gentler past. Morrison's cruel face flashed in her mind. And then Thomas's stepping into the path of danger for a woman he didn't know. Days turned into a week. There was no word from Charles Whitley. The isolation of the ranch began to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a cage. And yet, it was a cage she was beginning to understand. She saw the relentless labor that kept the place running, mending fences, tending the small herd of cattle, chopping wood, until his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. She saw the profound loneliness in the way he sometimes paused in his work, staring out at the vast, empty horizon. Then the sky turned a bruised purple and apricot, and the heavens opened. Rain fell not in drops, but in solid gray sheets. It hammered the roof, turned the corral to a sea of mud, and swelled the creek at the bottom of the hollow into a raging brown torrent. "Flash flood," Thomas said, peering out the window. The sound of the rushing water was a deafening roar. "There goes the bridge to town. We're stranded." They were trapped, cut off from the world. The cabin, which had seemed spare, now felt small, intimate. They were forced to rely on each other to move in a shared space, to speak in the quiet moments between chores. He taught her how to bank the fire so it would last through the night. She found a stash of flour and sugar and surprised him with biscuits that tasted, he admitted, almost as good as his mother's. Their mutual respect began to deepen into a fragile affection. They worked side by side, shoring up a section of the corral fence, threatened by the floodwaters, their hands brushing, sending an unexpected jolt through Eleanor. In the evenings, with the rain drumming a constant rhythm on the roof, they talked. Guarded stories of their pasts were exchanged like precious currency. She told him of Boston, of feeling like a bird in a gilded cage. He listened, his gaze steady, offering no pity, only a quiet understanding. He spoke of the land, of building the cabin board by board. Came west after the war, he said, his voice dropping. Needed the quiet. He never spoke of the war itself, but sometimes at night, Eleanor would hear him cry out in his sleep from the barn, a single sharp word lost to the sound of the rain. The floodwaters receded as slowly as they had risen, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening. The bridge was gone, a tangle of splintered wood. It would be weeks before it was rebuilt. They were truly alone, and in that isolation, their connection, unspoken and profound, grew stronger. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the silence was no longer awkward, but comfortable. "Thank you, Thomas," Eleanor said softly, "for everything." He looked at her, the firelight dancing in his eyes, and for the first time, she saw the shadows recede. "You don't need to thank me for doing what's right, Eleanor." It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it in his low voice was both a comfort and a danger. It felt like a promise, and it terrified her. She was promised to another man, a man who represented a respectable, if loveless, future. Thomas Callahan represented something else entirely, something wild and uncertain, but honest and real. The day the rider appeared on the horizon, the sun was bright and the air was clear. The world felt new, full of possibility. Eleanor's heart sank. Charles Whitley had finally arrived. He was not alone. He rode a fine black stallion, flanked by two hard-faced men. Whitley himself was exactly as his letters had suggested, a man whose considerable girth spoke of good living, dressed in an expensive Eastern suit that looked absurdly out of place. He dismounted with a flourish, his face wreathed in an apologetic smile. "My dearest Eleanor," he boomed, taking her hand and bowing over it. His touch was damp and cold. "1,000 apologies. This untamed country with its floods and its inconveniences. I trust this good man has taken care of you." His eyes flickered toward Thomas, who stood silently on the porch, his expression unreadable. There was a dismissive arrogance in Whitley's gaze, the look of a man assessing livestock. "Mr. Callahan has been a perfect gentleman," Eleanor said, withdrawing her hand. Of course. Whitley said, his charm a smooth, polished veneer. "Well, your ordeal is over, my dear. I've arranged a room for you in town, the best the place has to offer. We'll be married as soon as the circuit judge arrives next month." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Beneath the polished exterior, Eleanor felt an unsettling coldness, a predatory stillness that chilled her to the bone. As she gathered her meager belongings, her gaze met Thomas's across the room. A world of unspoken things passed between them, regret, longing, and a shared sense of loss. He had saved her from Morrison, sheltered her from the storm, and shown her a kindness she had never known. Now she was leaving the sanctuary of his quiet ranch for the gilded cage offered by Charles Whitley. And she knew with a certainty that ached in her soul that she was walking back into a prison. Life in Willow Creek, under the patronage of Charles Whitley, was suffocating. The room he arranged for her at the boarding house was clean, but the windows felt barred. Whitley showered her with gifts, dresses of silk and lace that were impractical for the dusty town, expensive jewelry that felt like shackles. He was attentive, charming, and utterly controlling. He spoke of our future, of the grand house he would build, of the power they would wield in the territory. It was all a performance, and Eleanor was his prize exhibit. She felt trapped, her burgeoning independence withering under his possessive gaze. His dialogue was a smooth, charming veneer, hiding a core of predatory arrogance. "My dear lady," he'd say, "justice in this territory is not a right. It is a commodity I happen to own." He began a subtle, cruel campaign against Thomas, framing it all as a series of unfortunate accidents. A fire, quickly extinguished, broke out in a hay shed on Thomas's property. Whitley was the first to offer condolences and financial aid, which Thomas quietly refused. A stray bull from Whitley's massive herd trampled a section of Thomas's newly mended fence, scattering his cattle. Whitley was profusely apologetic. "Such a shame," he said to Eleanor over dinner. "Callahan is a good man, but he seems plagued by misfortune. Perhaps this land is simply too much for one man to handle." Eleanor knew it was no accident. She saw the quiet satisfaction in Whitley's eyes. He was not just claiming her. He was methodically destroying the man he saw as his rival. She had to warn Thomas. She began taking long walks in the afternoons, slipping away from the watchful eyes of Whitley's men. She found a secluded path that led toward Thomas's ranch. Their first meeting was tense and awkward. "You shouldn't be here," Thomas said, his voice rough. He stood by his corral, mending a leather strap, not looking at her. "It's not safe." "I know what Whitley is doing," she said, her words tumbling out. "The fire, the bull, it's him. He's trying to ruin you." Thomas's hands stilled. He finally looked at her, his blue eyes full of a pain that mirrored her own. "This is my fight, Eleanor. You need to stay away. For your own good." "No," she insisted. "He's doing this because of me. It's my fight too." They began to meet in secret, two conspirators working to uncover the truth. In the quiet shade of a cottonwood grove, they became partners. The bond forged during the flood deepened, strengthened by shared danger. He told her about the whispers in town about men who had crossed Whitley in the past and mysteriously lost their land or their livelihoods. She told him of Whitley's veiled threats, his boasts of owning the sheriff and the bank. One afternoon, seeking refuge from the oppressive heat in Thomas's cabin, Eleanor was dusting the bookshelf. Her fingers brushed against a small, locked wooden box. "What's this?" she asked. Thomas, who had been cleaning his rifle, stiffened. "Just some old things from before." His hesitation piqued her curiosity. Later, while he was out checking on his herd, she found a small key hanging on a nail behind a calendar. Her hands shaking, she opened the box. Inside were a few tintypes, a cavalry medal, and a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. She picked up the top photograph. It showed a much younger Thomas, proud and straight, in a Union Army cavalry uniform. Standing beside him was another young man, his arms slung around Thomas's shoulders in a gesture of easy camaraderie. The man's face was leaner, happier, but the features were unmistakable. He looked unnervingly like a younger, more innocent Charles Whitley. A cold dread washed over her. This wasn't just a rivalry over a woman or a piece of land. This was something older, deeper, and far more dangerous. The photograph felt like a key, unlocking a past that Thomas had kept buried, a past that was now threatening to consume them all. That evening, the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken questions. Eleanor waited until they had finished their meager supper of coffee and bread. She placed the photograph on the rough-hewn table between them. The two smiling young men in uniform stared up ghosts from another life. "Who is he, Thomas?" she asked softly. Thomas stared at the image, and the color drained from his face. The shadows in his eyes, the ones she had seen from the very beginning, returned with a terrifying intensity. He looked like a man seeing a ghost. His name was Daniel, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Daniel Whitley. Whitley's brother, Eleanor breathed. He nodded, not looking at her. We served together. He was my second in command, my friend. What happened to him? Thomas flinched as if struck. He pushed back from the table, pacing the small room like a caged animal. Trouble finds folks out here. He said the words a hollow echo of their first meeting. Best not to go looking for it. This isn't trouble. I went looking for Eleanor, insisted, standing to face him. It found us. I need to understand Thomas. What hold does his brother's memory have on him, on you? Thomas stopped pacing and turned to her, his face a mask of torment. You don't want to know. It's a part of my life I buried a long time ago. Whitley is using it to destroy you. To destroy us. She cried, her voice breaking. You have to tell me. No, he said, and the finality in his tone was like a door slamming shut. I can't. He took a deep breath, and the words that came next were like stones, each one heavier than the last. Eleanor, you need to leave. Go back to town. Marry Whitley. She stared at him, stunned into silence. What are you saying? He's a powerful man, Thomas continued, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He can give you a safe life, a comfortable one. I can't protect you from him. I can't even protect myself. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He'll never stop. Not as long as you're with me. You'd be safer with him. The cruelty of his words was a physical blow. He wasn't just rejecting her. He was telling her to embrace the very prison she had fled. He was sacrificing their fledgling love for her safety, a sacrifice she did not want. Is that what you really want? She asked, her heart breaking. For me to marry that man? For a fleeting second, his composure cracked. She saw a flicker of raw agony in his eyes, a silent scream of protest. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a cold, resolute mask. It's what's best, he said. Heartbroken and confused, Eleanor turned and fled the cabin, the photograph still clutched in her hand. The wall Thomas had built around himself, the one she had so carefully started to dismantle, was back up higher and stronger than before. He had pushed her away, leaving her utterly and completely alone, caught between a monster who wanted to own her and a haunted hero who refused to let her in. The Wyoming wind felt colder than ever, whispering of betrayals past and dangers yet to come. Believing he had successfully driven Eleanor away, Charles Whitley felt a surge of triumph. He had broken Thomas Callahan's spirit. Now it was time to break the man himself. He escalated his attacks, moving from subtle sabotage to open aggression. He rode into Willow Creek and, using the considerable weight of his financial influence, began to poison the well of public opinion. He gathered a few men at the saloon and spoke in tones of grave concern. It's a sad business, this rustling, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Cattle going missing all over the valley. My herd, the Hendersons. And it all started right after that drifter Callahan settled here. He produced a branding iron altered just enough to mimic Thomas's brand. Found this near a back canyon on my property, alongside the tracks of a small herd heading straight for Callahan's land. The accusation was audacious, a blatant lie, but Whitley was a master manipulator. He owned the bank that held the loans for half the businesses in town. He controlled the freight contracts that kept the community supplied. Fear was a more powerful currency than truth. The law, in the form of the timid Sheriff Wade, was quick to fall in line. A warrant was issued. The townsfolk, many of whom had begun to respect Thomas, now looked away when he rode into town. The whispers followed him down the main street. The blacksmith was suddenly too busy to shoe his horse. The general store owner apologetically refused him credit. Thomas was an outcast, his reputation in tatters. He was isolated, facing the loss of the one thing he had built from the ashes of his past, his home. Eleanor, miserable in her room at the boarding house, heard the rumors. She knew they were lies, another turn of the screw in Whitley's vicious game. She refused to believe Thomas would abandon her to her fate. His rejection had been an act of protection, however misguided. Now he was the one who needed protecting. She confronted Whitley in the lobby of the boarding house, her voice ringing with cold fury. "You're framing him. You know he's not a rustler." Whitley's charming smile was gone, replaced by a look of cruel satisfaction. "My dear, you are overwrought. The evidence is quite clear. But there is a simple way to make all this unpleasantness disappear." He took her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Agree to set a wedding date. Publicly stand by my side. A man is far more lenient when his future bride pleads for a neighbor's case. Perhaps I could even be persuaded to misplace the evidence." The blackmail was sickeningly clear. Her submission in exchange for Thomas's freedom. "I will never marry you," she said, her voice trembling with rage. Whitley's eyes narrowed. "Then you will watch him hang. Or if he resists arrest, you will watch him be shot down like a dog. The choice, my dear, is yours." The trap was closing. Eleanor felt a wave of despair. But then she thought of Thomas's quiet strength, of the courage he'd shown facing down Morrison. She would not let this bully win. That night, she slipped out of the boarding house and rode under the cover of darkness to the one place she might find an ally. She knocked on the door of the Henderson ranch. Sam Henderson, a man whose family had ranched in the valley for 2 generations, opened it, his face grim. "Miss Dawson," he said, "this is not a good time." "I know what Whitley is saying about Thomas," she said quickly. "And I know it's a lie. He's being framed." Sam's wife, Sarah, appeared behind him. "We know that, child. Tom Callahan is an honest man. But Whitley, he holds the note on our ranch. On half the ranches in this valley. If we cross him, we lose everything. And if you let him do this," Eleanor countered, her voice pleading, "if you let him destroy a good man out of fear, what kind of a life will you have left? You'll still be living under his thumb, waiting for the day he decides he wants your land too." Her words hung in the air. She saw the conflict in their faces, the battle between fear and conscience. She left them with that thought, riding away into the darkness, not knowing if she had planted a seed of rebellion or simply endangered another family. The storm came from the west, a monstrous churning wall of ochre dust that swallowed the sky. It descended on the valley, not with the cleansing promise of rain, but with the suffocating fury of a plague. The sun vanished. The world turned a hellish twilight red. Wind screamed around the eaves of Thomas's cabin, driving grit through every crack and keyhole. This was the cover Charles Whitley had been waiting for. Eleanor had ridden to the ranch at dawn, a desperate warning on her lips. "He's coming for you, Thomas. He's using the rustling charge as an excuse." Thomas had simply nodded, his face grim. He had been expecting it. They had spent the morning barricading the windows and checking their small arsenal: Thomas's rifle, a spare shotgun, and an old cavalry pistol. Now, as the dust storm raged, they waited. The isolation was absolute. The world had shrunk to the 4 walls of the cabin, a tiny island in a sea of roaring chaos. They appeared like specters out of the swirling dust: Whitley, Morrison, and 4 other men, their faces wrapped in bandanas, their forms hazy and demonic in the red gloom. Callahan. Whitley's voice was a distorted shout against the wind. You're under arrest for cattle rustling. Come out with your hands up. This is my land, Whitley Thomas yelled back, his voice muffled by the cabin walls. You have no authority here. A shot splintered the door. The siege had begun. Eleanor knelt by the window, the shotgun heavy in her hands, her heart hammering against her ribs. Gunfire erupted from both sides, the flashes of light swallowed instantly by the choking dust. It was a chaotic blind fight. They couldn't see their attackers, and their attackers couldn't see them. There was a crash of glass from the back of the cabin. They're at the bedroom window, Eleanor cried. Thomas shoved a heavy table against the back room door. Stay here, he yelled, moving toward the front, trying to draw their fire. Suddenly, the front door shuddered under a heavy impact, then burst inward. Morrison stood there, a cruel grin on his face. Behind him, silhouetted against the swirling red dust, was Whitley. Thomas fired his rifle from the hip. Morrison dove to the side, rolling behind the cover of the overturned porch bench. Whitley stepped into the cabin, a pistol in his hand, his eyes wild. It's over, Callahan. He snarled, the wind whipping his fine coat around him. It was never about the cattle, was it? Thomas said, slowly lowering his rifle as Morrison covered him. The cattle. The land, even the woman. Whitley laughed, a harsh grating sound. They were just tools, a means to an end. He stepped closer, his face contorted with a decade of hatred. This is about my brother. This is for Daniel. He gestured with his pistol toward a faded spot on the wall. He died in a place called Miller's Cornfield. A stupid, pointless battle in a stupid, pointless war. And you were his commanding officer. You gave the order that sent him to his death. Thomas's face was ashen. He didn't deny it. It was war, Charles. I made a tactical decision. I never wanted him to die. You were jealous of him. Whitley raged. He was beloved by the men, a natural leader. You saw him as a threat, so you sent him on a suicide charge. The accusation, born of grief and paranoia, hung in the dust-choked air. I have spent years planning this, luring you out here where you had nothing, just to watch you build something. Something I could take away. I brought her here. He gestured at Eleanor, the perfect final piece. To take away the one thing you might have learned to love, just as you took my brother from me. In that moment, Thomas's shoulders slumped, the weight of a guilt he had carried for years, finally crushing him. I am sorry, Charles. He said, his voice raw with pain. I live with that day every day. If you want revenge, take it. Oh, I will, Whitley sneered, raising his pistol. No, Eleanor screamed, raising the shotgun. But Whitley's own words, fueled by his rage, became his undoing. He looked up to you, you coward. He shrieked at Thomas. He would have followed you into hell. But you weren't there. I was supposed to be covering his flank. But the fire, it was too much. I pulled back. He was alone, because of me. Eat this. The confession burst from him, an ugly volcanic eruption of truth. The secondary twist. The room fell silent, at the only sound, the shriek of the wind. Whitley's eyes widened in horror as he realized what he had said. His entire justification, the righteous vengeance that had fueled him for a decade, shattered. He hadn't been avenging his brother. He had been burying his own cowardice under a mountain of blame. I tried to save him, Thomas said, his voice low and full of a terrible sorrow. After you ran, I went back for him. I held him as he died. The revelation broke Whitley. A guttural sob escaped his lips. His carefully constructed world had crumbled to dust. Morrison, seeing his employer broken, made his move. He rose from behind the bench, his pistol aimed at Thomas. But Eleanor had been waiting. The shotgun roared, the blast deafening in the small cabin. Morrison was thrown backward out the door and into the storm, his chest a ruin of buckshot. The spell was broken. Whitley stared at Eleanor, then at Thomas, his face a canvas of disbelief and madness. He raised his pistol, a wild, cornered animal. Thomas lunged not at Whitley, but at Eleanor, shoving her to the floor as Whitley's gun fired. The bullet tore through the wall where she had been standing. Thomas rolled, coming up with his cavalry pistol. The two men fired at the same time. The explosions were a single deafening clap of thunder. Whitley crumpled to the floor, a dark stain spreading across the front of his fine suit. Thomas stood swaying, his hand pressed to his side, his face pale but his eyes clear for the first time in years. He had fought not for land, not for vengeance, but to protect his future. And in the heart of the storm, he had won. As the dust storm cleared, it was as if a curtain was being lifted on the aftermath of a great battle. The screaming wind died to a mournful whisper, and a weak red sun pierced the haze, illuminating the destruction. The cabin was scarred with bullet holes, the door hanging from a single hinge. Outside, the bodies of Whitley's men lay where they had fallen, half buried in drifts of fine red dust. Inside, Whitley was dead. Thomas, bleeding from a deep graze along his ribs, leaned heavily against the wall, while Eleanor frantically tore strips from her dress to bandage the wound. The raw, terrible truth of the past hung in the air between them, more potent than the smell of gunpowder. They heard the sound of approaching horses. Thomas instinctively reached for his pistol, but Eleanor put a hand on his arm. Wait. It was Sam Henderson and his sons, their faces streaked with dust rifles in their hands. More riders appeared behind them, the Kowalski brothers, Dr. Hartley, even a few of the townsfolk who had previously shunned them. We heard the shooting, Sam said, his eyes taking in the scene with grim understanding. He looked at Whitley's body. Just before the storm hit. Whitley cornered my boy in town, bragged about how he was going to come out here and finish things. My boy came and got me. We rounded up who we could. He looked at Thomas, then at Eleanor, his face full of shame. We should have stood with you sooner. We let fear make us cowards. His confession seemed to open a floodgate. The others murmured their agreement. It was a silent apology, an offering of support, however late. Dr. Hartley pushed through his bag in hand. "Let me see that son," he said to Thomas, his voice gentle but firm, as he worked the townsfolk quietly and respectfully, carried the bodies of the dead out of the cabin. Sam Henderson found Morrison's body and, searching his pockets for identification, pulled out a tarnished silver locket. He looked at it then, at Eleanor's bare neck, and handed it to her without a word. Eleanor clicked it open. Her mother's tiny faded portrait looked up at her safe and unharmed. She clutched it in her hand, a tangible link to her past now restored. Later that evening, after the doctor had stitched Thomas's side and the last of the neighbors had departed, leaving offers of help and promises of a new beginning, they sat alone by the fire. The cabin was a wreck, but it was their wreck. It was their home. The guilt that Thomas had carried for a decade had been lifted, but the sorrow remained. He finally told her the full story of that day at Miller's cornfield. He spoke of Daniel Whitley's bravery, of the chaos and terror of the battle, and of the impossible choices officers had to make. He described finding Daniel after Charles had fled and holding his friend as his life slipped away. His last words, Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. He told me to tell Charles it wasn't his fault, that he was a good brother. He shook his head. I never told him. When I saw Charles after the battle, the hatred in his eyes was already there. He'd already built his story, the one where I was the villain and he was the grieving hero. Nothing I could have said would have changed it. He finally looked at Eleanor, his eyes clear of the shadows she had seen since the day they met. I let him put that guilt on me. Maybe I deserved it. I gave the order. "You were a soldier in a war," Eleanor said softly, taking his hand. "You did your duty. Whitley was the one who abandoned his." She brought his hand to her lips. "The past is a ghost, Thomas. It only has the power we give it. We can let it haunt us, or we can let it go." He leaned his head against her shoulder, his body heavy with exhaustion and release. Outside, the first stars began to appear in the clean-washed sky. The storm was over. The dead were buried. And in the quiet aftermath, 2 survivors began finally to heal. Months later, spring arrived in the valley with a quiet insistence, painting the hillsides with the tender green of new life. The ranch was thriving. The bullet-scarred cabin had been repaired and expanded, its wounds healed much like its owners. A new, larger barn stood proudly built with the help of the very neighbors who had once turned their backs. Thomas and Eleanor were married by the circuit judge in a simple ceremony under the vast Wyoming sky. The entire community, now free of Whitley's influence, attended. It was a celebration not just of a marriage, but of their collective survival and rebirth. The world Thomas and Eleanor had forged was one of truth and hardship, and their love, tested by fire, was stronger for it. Thomas, his quiet integrity now recognized and respected, was asked by the townsfolk to become the new county sheriff. After a long talk with Eleanor, he accepted, ready to build a future based on the real justice he had fought so hard for, not the perverted version Whitley had wielded like a club. One warm afternoon, a letter arrived bearing a Boston postmark. It was from Eleanor's sister, informing her that their estranged father had passed away. In his last days, filled with regret, he had amended his will, leaving Eleanor a modest inheritance. It wasn't a fortune, but it was an acknowledgement, a final silent apology. Eleanor didn't use the money for new dresses or fine furniture. She walked into the Willow Creek Bank, and the same bank Morrison had robbed the day she arrived, and to the shock of the manager, used her inheritance to buy a controlling interest. She ensured the community would never again be held hostage by the financial whims of one powerful man. She had secured not just her own independence, but the freedom of her neighbors. That evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the land, Thomas took his old Union cavalry saber from the wooden box where it had rested for a decade. He walked to the small hill overlooking their ranch, the place where they had first seen their future together. With Eleanor by his side, he dug a deep hole in the rich earth and buried the sword, laying to rest the ghost of the soldier he had been. It was a final farewell to the war and the guilt he had carried from it. When they returned to the cabin, Eleanor took the silver locket recovered and polished from her jewelry box. It was no longer a symbol of a past she was fleeing, but a cherished piece of the woman she had become. She didn't put it away. Instead, she hung it on a small nail over the mantelpiece, where the firelight could catch it. Her past now had an honorable place in her new home, a quiet reminder of the journey that had brought her here. They stood together, his arm around her, her head on his shoulder, watching the flames dance. Two souls who had found each other in chaos, who had laid their pasts to rest to build a future together. A future that was already growing, a quiet promise of new life within Eleanor. They would raise their family here on this land, in this community they had helped to heal, creating hope and life, where there had once only been death and revenge.